Hello.
Hello, please.
Yeah, what's the problem, sir?
We just drove down our farm track.
Yeah.
Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it.
Yeah.
It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
At 13:42 hours, I saw a blue transit van, index number Lima 98 Yankee Delta X-ray, leave the entrance to the premises known as G&T Commercials, Barham, Suffolk. The vehicle was towing a trailer, on which was an orange and black rigid hold inflatable boat. The vehicle and trailer headed westbound on the A14. At 13:50 hours, the vehicle and trailer left the A14 at the Stonemark exit and proceeded to the roundabout at the bottom of the slip road. It then circled the roundabout twice before taking the exit towards the Tesco petrol station. At approximately 13:51, the vehicle went to the fueling area. From a position in the supermarket car park, I saw a white male wearing a maroon top, steel, standing on top of the trailer, filling the rib with fuel. At 13:56 hours, I saw a second male, whom I would describe as white, well-built, with short dark hair, balding on top, Womes. He was wearing a brown leather jacket and dark trousers and was looking up at the male refueling the rib. At 14:01 hours, Womes went into the petrol payment kiosk. At 14:02 hours, Steele climbed down from the rib. At 14:08 hours, the vehicle and trailer departed, heading towards Felixstowe on the A14. At 14:25, the vehicle left at the A12 exit. It then circled the roundabout twice before taking the first road towards Levington Marina. At 14:58, I saw the vehicle with just one occupant, Womes, heading away from the marina. At this point, the vehicle was still towing the trailer, which had water dripping from it, but the rib was no longer there. End of log. Steele and Womes had no idea they were being watched, but years of smuggling experience meant that whenever he was on a job, Steele would ensure that everyone practiced basic anti-surveillance techniques. Every roundabout had to be driven around at least twice, and every now and then you should pull over and wait for 20 cars to go past you. So far as the police and customs teams were concerned, Steele's antics were a bit of a pain in the arse, but caused them no real problems. They had now established that the boat had been launched and was on its way to Blankenberg. All they had to do now was wait for its return, and they would be able to catch Steele red-handed. The only fly in the ointment was that although customs knew the exact methods that Steele used to get his drugs into the country, they had no idea where he actually landed them before heading back out to sea and working on his fishing trip cover story. The speed at which events were now moving had taken the police team by surprise. By the time they called customs in, it was too late for any air support to be brought in to follow the boat. Instead, all that Bill Davidson and his team could do was stake out a few likely landing points. But at 11 p.m, a report came in that a boat was being landed at Brightlingsea Harbour. There were 2 people on board who looked as though they'd been fishing. Wherever the drugs landing had been, the team had missed it. There was a lot of pressure to arrest Steele anyway, said Davidson, but there was no point. We had no drugs and only the most circumstantial evidence of any involvement in smuggling. It would have been a November bust all over again. We might have kept him out of the game for a couple of weeks, but he'd just go right back at it. And the worst thing would be that he'd be aware that he was being watched. We decided to leave it, make sure we were far better prepared the second time around. Every customs officer has a system. George Stevens had several, but his favourite was to add together all the figures in that day's date and then count off the passing cars until he reached that number. And so it was that by pure chance on the 14th of April 1996, car number 34, a white Mondeo passing through Dover just after 9:45 p.m, got pulled over for a random inspection. At training school, frontline inspectors spend hours learning how to read the subtle affections of speech and body language that can help to indicate that a person is lying. It might be a brief loss of eye contact, a minor shudder in the voice, even an idle hand gesture. Mastering and fine-tuning such a skill can take many years of dedicated service, but as any customs officer will tell you, many of those who pass through make it so obvious that they are hiding something that even a trained monkey could tell. As the white Mondeo pulled over to one side, George Stevens walked over to the driver's window and waited for him to wind it down. "Good evening, sir," said Stevens. "Would you mind telling me your name and where you've been?" The driver was a small-time crook, hired by Tate's gang at short notice. He was nervous and turned out to be hopeless at hiding it. Sure. My name's, Andrewlakos. Craig Andrewlakos. Yeah, I've just come back from Paris. I was over there seeing, this bird I met a couple of weeks ago, yeah." "I see. And this is your car, sir?" "No." There was a pause. "It's hired. A friend of mine hired it." "Who was that then?" There was another pause, this time slightly longer. The customs officer spoke again. "I need to know the name of your friend who hired the car, sir." Tiny beads of sweat formed on Craig's forehead as he struggled to remember, struggled to stay cool, and then in a flash, the name came to him. Nick Reynolds. It was not the most convincing performance he could have hoped for, so Andrewlakos was hardly surprised when he was asked to get out of the car so that it could be searched. His situation went from bad to worse. The obvious place to start was the glove box, where Stevens found the agreement from Budget Rent-A-Car. "This car's been hired by someone called Darren Nichols." Andrewlakos could have kicked himself. "Oh, yeah, that's him. That's my friend. Oh, silly me." In the boot, Stevens found a pair of fisherman's waders that were still damp with seawater and had sand sticking to them. In his hand luggage, Stevens found maps of the Netherlands and Belgium. In his pockets were scraps of paper with names and mobile phone numbers. It was all pretty suspicious, but there was nothing illegal, nothing to warrant an arrest. Having gone through everything once with a fine-tooth comb, Stevens decided to search the car all over again before finally letting the man go and rushing off to the office to run some names through the computer. Darren Nichols states, "Mick called me the following Monday morning and told me that the Mondeo was at his house and I could collect it. I got my wife to drop me off at his house and we got into Mick's car to drive to the Robin Hood pub, because that's where he'd left the Mondeo, in the car park. My heart sank. Why had he parked it there? Mick almost looked embarrassed as he explained that the car had been pulled up and searched twice over. The reason they got pulled was because the driver couldn't remember my name, the name that the car had been hired in." "Who the hell was driving it?" Some silly South African. I told him your name. All they had to do was say they borrowed it off you when you were drunk to come over on a day trip. Mick told me to expect police or customs to come round and ask about the car, and just to make up an excuse if they did. While he was saying all this, I sat in the Mondeo and switched the engine on. It was empty. I complained to Mick and eventually he gave me 30 quid. When I took the car home, I had a closer look at it and found loads of small scratches. I spent a couple of hours cleaning and polishing it up. I was more worried about the £150 excess that I might lose than the fact that someone else had driven the car, because I knew that getting any more money out of Mick would be like getting blood out of a stone. I took the car back early, and I spent the night dreaming of the day that he would get caught. Around the 30th of April 1996, Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley retired after more than 30 years in the police force. The celebrations were only slightly marred by the fact that there had been no arrest in the Rettendon case. After all, Dibley knew exactly who had done it and how. As he handed over the investigation to Detective Superintendent Brian Story, the man who had pursued the drug dealers behind the death of Leah Betts, he knew that it was at most only a matter of weeks before arrests were made. With so much groundwork having already been done, Story's task, though by no means easy, was greatly simplified. He organised a mass briefing between the police and customs teams to discuss tactics. It didn't take too long. It was clear that the boat was the key factor, and a decision was taken to place G&T commercials under 24-hour surveillance. Customs spotters' planes were also put on standby and dozens of undercover officers were earmarked for duty. Intelligence reports showed that Tate and company had just left for Spain. As soon as the transmissions from their mobile phones showed that they were on their way back north, the whole shooting match would swing into action. This time, there would be no mistake. Darren Nichols states, "I got my fingers burnt with a Mondeo, but this was different. I had an E-Reg Jag for sale, which had been in the paper for a couple of weeks with not much interest, when Mick phoned me up and said he was interested in buying it. Ian Peter Corey turned up at my house at around 5 p.m, and Corey took the car for a drive around the block. Once he got back, Nick said he'd give me £3,000 and we shook hands on it. We never talked about it in detail, but I know Mick was hoping to use it to tow the boat and trailer, rather than always using Jack's transit van. I mean, I didn't care what he did with it. Once he bought it, the car was out of my hands and nothing to do with me. Mick said he didn't have that amount of money on him at that moment, but he'd pay me after the weekend. No problem, Mick. Do you and Peter fancy a cup of tea? No, we're in a bit of a hurry actually, Darren, said Mick. We'd better get going. Darren Nichols states, I was really starting to worry about DC Bird. He was still going on about this idea of me selling gear to people and then him nicking them. It hadn't happened yet though. He had a weird way of working. There were some things that he'd tell me that I'm sure I was never supposed to hear, and others that he would keep mum about, even if I already knew. I wonder whether everything he was saying, including all the stuff about letting Mick and Jack carry on for now, was just some kind of smokescreen. After all, I couldn't work out why he wasn't jumping up and down with excitement at the prospect of bringing them in. Surely that was worth more praise than half a dozen small-time street dealers. Maybe he was just being cool. Or maybe he was just being crap. I was starting to lose faith that it was ever going to happen. But I'd travelled so far down the road with him that there was no point in turning back. I spent most of Friday night and a fair amount of Saturday morning working out what I was going to do with the money from the Jag. So when Mick called me up later that morning to say that he didn't want it after all, I felt as though a part of my world had collapsed. In order to be capable of pulling the boat, the Jaguar needed a tow bar fitted, but because it was one of these models with a digital dashboard, it needed a special module. Mick asked if he could borrow my Land Rover, and when I agreed, he told me to come round and pick up the Jag when I dropped the Land Rover off. I had a few things to do that day, so I didn't set off for Meadow Cottage until Saturday evening. Once I arrived, Mick drove me in his Hilux over to the Robin Hood pub car park where he had left the Jag. He said he'd put £30 worth of petrol in the car and would also buy me a drink sometime to make up for the inconvenience. For the first time in a long time, I felt a strange twinge of guilt. There I was, trying my hardest to get this bloke nicked, and all of a sudden he was treating me with a bit of respect. I didn't hear from Mick again until Sunday morning, when he asked me if I could do him a huge favour and give him a lift to meet Jack that afternoon. We arranged to meet him in a pub near Great Bentley Village, and I set off in my Jag in the middle of the afternoon. I was waiting in the car park when Mick turned up in his Toyota RAV4 being driven by Jackie Street. Paul Gwinnett was also in the car. Mick and Paul took a couple of bags and some fishing rods out of the Toyota and put them in the back of my car before both getting in. Where to, Guff? I asked Mick. It was pretty obvious I'd been magically transformed into a cab driver for the day, so I thought I might as well act like one. Mick told me to go up the A12 towards the Ipswich roundabout. More than once he told me not to drive so fast, and when we got to the Copdock roundabout, he told me to do a right turn and stop at the first petrol station I saw. I did so, and I saw Jack already in the garage with his blue Transit towing a trailer carrying the boat. Right, I'll just cut in here, and this may be the only time I actually interject in this video, or this episode I should say. Now, what I find interesting here is, bearing in mind this is in Darren Nichols' own words, it's the level of detail he uses. Like, we went to this roundabout, we did a right turn, Jack was there in his Transit, we spoke about this, we spoke about that. You know, I said, oh, where to, Gov? I might as well be a taxi driver for the day. It's the level of detail that Darren Nichols goes into when recalling these versions of events. Yet when we take a look back at his official statement for the night of December the 6th, it is completely lacking in any clarity or any level of detail whatsoever. I mean, it's incredibly easy to say, well, Darren Nichols was a heavy drinker, you know, he was a forgetful person, how could he have possibly remembered anything that happened on December the 6th? You know, this was a life-changing event for Darren Nichols, and I guess putting yourself in Nichols' position for one moment, he was caught between, you know, admitting prior knowledge of these murders about to take place and also giving enough credible evidence to prove he was there. So it was a very, very fine balancing act for Darren Nichols, if in fact he was telling an element of truth in his version of events. Anyway, let's continue from where we left off. We all got out and went into the garage while Jack filled the boat with petrol. I thought I'd be leaving them there, but Mick told me he wanted me to drive him and Gwinnett to Levington Marina. We stopped in a lay-by just outside, and Mick and Paul opened their bags and put on a couple of dry suits. They then unstrapped the boat, removed the number plates, and made it ready to go straight into the water. At 17:11, I saw a blue transit van towing a black and orange rigid hull inflatable boat with a large blue engine mounted, drive into Levington Marina, immediately followed by a black Jaguar which contained 3 occupants. At 17:11, a man who had been identified to me as Jack Womes parked the van near the Harbour Master's office and went in. At 17:15, the van, vehicle reg Lima 98 Yankee Delta X-ray, with the ribs still attached, was parked by the Harbour office. The empty Jaguar was parked alongside. Jack Womes and a man who had been identified to me as Michael Steele were standing talking together and looking down at the slipway. A third man, who I'd describe as stocky with curly black hair, Nichols, was standing looking around in the general area. At 17:20, the blue van and rib turned around and drove towards the slip. At 17:25, the rib was reversed down the slip with Michael Steele, who was wearing a blue/red sailing suit, and a fourth man, Gwinnett, who had collar-length hair and was wearing a light blue waterproof trousers and dark jacket already on board. The engine was started immediately and the boat entered the water. The vessel then manoeuvred at the bottom of the slip and exited the marina via the harbour entrance. It then headed east down the River Orwell towards the North Sea. The blue transit van driven by Womes then drove up the slip and out of the marina. The third man, Nichols, who had been standing watching the vessel launch and looking around, then walked to the Jaguar and drove out of the marina at 17:28. I was then involved in the mobile surveillance operation of the blue transit. Both the Jaguar and the transit were seen to stop at a lay-by close to the marina. The driver of the Jaguar then had a short conversation with Womes, who was sitting in the driver's seat of the transit van. Darren Nichols states, "I watched a boat go out to sea, and then Jack told me to meet him back in the lay-by. He was refitting the trailer when I pulled up behind him and then got into the transit. So how come you're not involved in our business these days?" he asked me. He was sitting in the driver's seat, staring forward through the windscreen. It was like he was trying to be cool or something. I scratched my head. Well, I don't have time, I ain't got a passport anymore, but the main thing is it just wasn't worth it. I never really earned much money out of it. Jack nodded slowly, still staring straight ahead. "Well, if you invested a bit of money in it," he continued, "then you'd make a lot more. Mick and I were talking and we wanted you to go down to Spain and run that end of the operation for us. We think you'd be good at it. We'd pay all your expenses and everything. It's a good offer." "No, I'm not really interested. I don't really think this is the right business for me, especially after what happened at Christmas." Jack's face suddenly erupted into a cheesy smile, which faded as quickly as it had appeared. Then he looked directly at me for the first time. "Here's the thing, Darren. We want you to get more involved. If you don't, that's going to cause problems. What happened to Pat could easily happen to you. You can be replaced." I suddenly got this weird sensation, like I was flying backwards really fast. I wanted to be sick. I felt my legs buckle, my throat dried up in an instant. I thought I was going to faint and had to hold on to the side of the transit to steady myself. I couldn't speak. I was numb with shock. Jack had just threatened to kill me. I was speechless. "I'll probably call you later tonight," Jack said. "I might need you to do us a favour. That won't be a problem, will it?" I looked at him. His eyes were dead. There was no humour in his face at all. He was like a machine. It crossed my mind that he'd probably had exactly the same look on his face when he'd carried out the murders. I forced out some words. "No, Jack, that won't be a problem at all." I was feeling a bit brave when I went to bed, so I switched the phone off. I woke up at around 5 a.m. feeling like an absolute pansy and dialed 1471. Jack had called me at around 2:30 a.m. I decided to call him back and pretend I'd fallen asleep. Why? Well, I still felt involved in the whole murder thing and didn't think I could just walk away for things just like that. Oh yeah, and I was also terrified of what he might do if he thought I was avoiding him. But at the back of my mind, I was really hoping that DC Bird had done his job and they'd all been banged up. I got through to Jack right away and he sounded really pleased to hear from me. He'd been fast asleep and needed to get up to meet the boat when it came back from the harbour. "Is everything okay?" I asked softly. "Yeah," said Jack brightly. "Everything's fine. No problems at all. You can pick up your Land Rover whenever you want. It's over at Mick's." "Okay, will do," I said and put the phone down. Then I swore to myself over and over until the wife woke up and asked me what I was going on about. My workmate Colin was due round at any time, so I thought I might as well take advantage of the extra pair of hands and pick the Land Rover up straight away. Once he arrived, I drove the two of us over to Mick's in the Jag, and then the two of us headed back towards Braintree in our little two-car convoy. Now, I'm not the paranoid type, but as we were on our way back, I had this feeling I was being followed. I knew it didn't make any sense. I hadn't done anything, but I just had this weird prickly sensation on the back of my neck. But every time I thought I'd spotted a car that was tailing me, it would turn off or something. So I guess it was all just in my mind, and soon forgot about it. As we were heading back, just before 5:30 a.m, my phone went off. It was Mick on his mobile. "We're fishing at sea. It's been a good night. We'll see you later on. Jack's going to get us out," he said. "Cheers, Mick. See you later," I replied. Then I started swearing to myself again. Up until that moment, I was hoping that maybe Mick had been arrested and Jack didn't know about it. No such luck. There were so many red faces at the Monday morning police and customs briefing, it looked like a clown convention. The operation had been meticulously planned, hugely expensive, and swallowed valuable resources and manpower. But it also looked like it had been a complete failure. Undercover officers had watched as Steele had met Womes at G&T commercials and picked up the boat. They had seen the boat being filled up with petrol, and Steele, driven by Nichols along with Gwinnett, arriving to meet Womes. They had followed the party down to the marina and seen the boat launched. From there, a spotter plane with a thermal imaging camera had followed the boat as it crossed the channel and eventually moored off the coast of Belgium at Blankenberg. The plane had to break off to refuel. Normally 2 would have been used in this sort of operation, but 1 had a fault. But it resumed a couple of hours later and picked up the boat on its way back to England. So far, so good. For the first time, thanks to the plane, Customs were able to see where Steele landed his boat, just along from the pier at Clacton. "We had always assumed it would have been somewhere a bit more remote," says Bill Davidson. "Anyone walking along the promenade would have been able to see what was going on." But the advantage to Steele was that he could see anyone coming. There was no place to park up for effective surveillance and no way of surprising him. I imagine Steele really liked the idea of being so open about it. There was always an element of bravado with everything he did. Quite a few of the officers chasing him don't mind saying they had a certain admiration for him. Once the landing point had been established, Customs had expected the remainder of the operation to be plain sailing. They thought the most likely scenario was that the 3 men would unload the boat and carry the drugs up the beach to a waiting vehicle. Instead, Womes drove the car right onto the beach itself, right up to the waterfront. They loaded the car there. Within seconds, he was driving off again. A police team attempted to follow him, but he was soon lost in the night. The whole operation was starting to fall apart. "He caught us on the hop," says Bill Davidson. "The plan had always been to wait until the stuff was landed and arrest the vehicle loaded with the gear, and then wait until the boat came back to the harbour and pick up the rest of the gang. We could have gone in when the gear was being unloaded, but that would have given Steele an easy escape route. All he would have needed to do is start the boat's engine and head out to sea. Even with our fastest cutters, we'd never have caught him." The surveillance team had been working virtually non-stop for 36 hours, but had nothing to show for it. They had no idea where the gear was, no idea where it was being kept, no evidence of drugs even being smuggled. The decision was taken to put all remaining sources on Nichols. He had played no part in the gear operation since the previous afternoon, and both Story and Davidson had a strong hunch that he would pick up some gear the following day. Easy to follow and far too lazy to bother with any of the anti-surveillance techniques that Mick had patiently taught him, Nichols was an easy target. He was also their last hope. By the time I got back home, I was so depressed about the fact that yet another run had been allowed to slip by that I just couldn't be bothered to do any work. At least not until later. I sent Colin home and went back to bed. Mick phoned me a bit later and asked me to go round at 1 p.m. All the way there, I still got the feeling that someone was watching me. I was almost 100% certain that the police were watching me. Eventually, it got so bad that I phoned DC Bird. "Oi, am I under surveillance? Are you lot following me?" "Nah, don't be stupid," Darren came to reply. "You're just being paranoid." "I don't think so, mate. I'm sure I'm being surveyed. I've been paranoid before and I'm telling you it doesn't feel anything like this." "I'm telling you, Darren, you're not being followed. If you were, I'd tell you, wouldn't I? I mean, I'm not going to drop you in it, am I? You're on our side. Just relax." "All right, listen. The shipment came in last night. I'm just going over to pick up my share." "I know," said DC Bird. "Mick's got it in his mum's garage. He hasn't even bothered to lock it. Don't worry, everything's under control. Just relax." I tried my best, but it wasn't quite good enough. In fact, I've been so distracted I completely forgot to ask DC Bird how he knew where the drugs were. It almost sounded like he'd been over there himself to check it out. Maybe something was going to happen after all. When I eventually arrived at Mick's, he was sitting in a chair by his caravan at the front of Meadow Cottage, sunning himself. He asked how much puff I wanted to take away with me. "I've got 10 if that's okay, but there's more if you want it." 10 kilos? 22 grand's worth? He obviously had it coming out of his ears. That was more than enough. I opened the toolbox and Mick threw in the bars, counting each one off until he reached 40. As they hit the bottom of the toolbox, I rearranged them neatly in order. I'd made Colin wait around the corner. I didn't want him getting involved, but when I returned, I put the toolbox of gear in the back of the van and let him drive it, with me following behind in the Jag. We set off for home and I phoned the wife to let her know what time I'd be back. Just as I put the phone down, Mick called. He sounded really frustrated, like he'd been working himself up into a frenzy. He asked me if there'd been anything in the Land Rover when I'd picked it up that morning. I told him there wasn't, and that I checked it carefully, and it was completely empty. Mick launched into a furious torrent of swear words down the line. "What's wrong?" I asked, totally confused. "Why do you want to know?" I could hear Mick's breathing getting harder and harder. "Because I fucking lost something, that's why." Then he hung up. It only took me a few seconds to realise it must have been some of the gear that had gone missing. As soon as it clicked, I was overcome with a huge fear that Mick might think I was responsible, that I was trying to rip him off. What with Jack being on the warpath and having threatened me the night before, that was the last thing I wanted. I phoned Mick back immediately. "Have you lost what I think you've lost?" He was still fuming. "Yes, I have." I assured him there was nothing at all in the Land Rover. Okay, he said, and hung up again. I was so caught up with what Mick was saying that I barely noticed the half a dozen police cars ahead of me and behind me until they started switching on their sirens. A couple of them pulled right in front, forcing me and Colin to stop. All I could see around me were flashing blue lights and dozens of uniforms heading towards me. Quick as a flash, I locked all the doors in the Jag, wound up the windows, pulled out my mobile and started dialing like a maniac. As soon as I heard Mick's voice, I spoke. "I'm being arrested," I said. The mixture of fear and excitement must have done something to my voice, because Mick didn't recognise me. "Who's that?" he said. "It's Darren, I'm being nicked." There was a pause, and I thought I heard him swear. Then the line went dead. By now, 2 or 3 coppers were banging on the windows of the Jag, telling me to put my phone down and get out of the car. I dialed again. My wife picked up on the second ring. "I won't be home after all. I'm being stopped by the police. I'll try and call you later. Bye." Outside, the coppers were frantically trying to get in. They had taken out their truncheons and were tapping on the glass. They started telling me in a really nasty way what was going to happen if I didn't open the door there and then. But I had one more call to make. He wasn't at his desk, so I called his pager. "DC Bird's message service," said the woman. "Can I take your message, please?" "Yeah, the message is, I'm being nicked." There was a stunned silence. "I'm sorry, sir," the woman said. "I don't think I can send that particular message." I was looking out of the window and I could see the cop nearest me contemplating breaking the glass. I had to act fast. "All right, just tell him that Darren has been arrested." Now, the last 2 phone calls I have no problem with, but up until this day I can't explain why I called Mick, let alone why I called him first. It's a complete mystery. I mean, after all, I've been doing everything within my power to engineer him being arrested for weeks, so it made no sense at all for when I actually thought it was going to happen to tip him off and give him a chance to escape. The only reason I can come up with is that I wanted to protect myself, to stop him thinking that his arrest was anything to do with me. Stupid, really, but I guess I wasn't thinking straight at the time. The second I stepped out of the car, they grabbed the phone off me and handcuffed my hands behind my back while I watched Colin being led off to a police van. "Do you know why you're being pulled up?" said the copper nearest to me. I shook my head. "Where have you come from?" he said. "Colchester," I replied. "Well," said the policeman, trying to think on his feet. "There have been a few burglaries in the Colchester area, so we've pulled you over because we'd like to search your van." I nodded. "Okay, fair enough. But everything in the van is mine. Colin is just driving for me. He's got nothing to do with anything. It's all down to me." "Okay, sir, fair enough." It didn't take long for them to find the toolbox. There wasn't anything else in the back of the van. "What are these then?" said the policeman. I thought I'd played a fool one last time. "Well, they look like chocolate bars to me. What do you think they are?" The policeman smiled. "I think they're drugs." And that was it. I was arrested on the spot. Over in the neighbouring county of Suffolk, Michael Steele and Jackie Street were bombing along the A12 towards the Ipswich roundabout in their Toyota RAV4, having left Great Bentley a little earlier in the day. Just up ahead, Peter Corey was driving Jack's blue transit van. The trio were on their way to G&T Commercials to see Jack. The call from Nichols had only come a few minutes earlier, but Steele was still taken by surprise when a convoy of unmarked cars suddenly appeared by his side and a man in a uniform gestured to him to pull over. Steele put his foot down. Two of the pursuit cars also accelerated, weaving around the traffic to take up positions just ahead and just to the side of the Toyota. Steele tried to drive his way out of trouble but was outclassed. Then the unmarked escort deliberately drove across his path, crashing into him and forcing him to a halt. A man leapt out and ran towards the driver's window. "I'm DC Chappell from Essex Police and I'm arresting you both on suspicion of being concerned in the importation of controlled drugs." Steele stepped out and glanced at the front of his car. "Has he damaged my bumper?" he said. One of the younger, keener officers stepped forward and put his hand on Steele's shoulder to guide him towards the car that would take him to the station. Steele's ice blue eyes turned a hole right through the youngster's head. "Take your hands off me, boy," Steele said. Never one to miss an opportunity, Steele would later lodge an official complaint about his arrest. He claimed the officers responsible were driven in a malicious manner, which could have resulted in serious injury or even death of him and his partner of 25 years. Steele also complained that when Jackie Street was finally released, she was horrified to discover that their home had been abused and damaged by the police. Money loaned to the couple from relatives was allegedly taken, and Street's vehicle was seized. "She has been maliciously penalised by overzealous officers," wrote Steele. "She is now unable to perform normal daytime duties. She has no one to turn to." A few feet further down the road, the door of Jack's transit van was opened by DC Sanders, who slapped his palm down on the quivering shoulder of Peter Corey. "You're nicked," he said triumphantly. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to supply controlled drugs." Corey stepped down to be cautioned and handcuffed and glanced over at Michael Steele and Jackie Street. Both surrounded by equal numbers of police officers, he swallowed hard and then spoke. "I don't know what you mean, mate." Jack Womes was at G&T Commercials cleaning an engine when Bill Davidson, other customs officers and a few members of the police armed response unit approached him. "Okay, Jack," said Davidson, "put down the power washer." Then Jack slowly looked around at the hordes of officers and gunmen surrounding him. "Fucking hell, Bill, it's a bit heavy, ain't it?" As he was driven away in handcuffs, Darren Nichols kept an eye out for a familiar face. Darren Nichols states, "They took me down to Chelmsford Police Station. All the way there and when we arrived, I kept looking out for DC Jim. I kept expecting him to pop up at any moment and say, 'Don't worry guys, it's alright, he's on our side.' I was sure this is all down to him, that he'd finally swooped and the reason I'd been arrested was to stop Mick and Jack from suspecting I'd grassed them up. They let Colin go home a couple of hours later. They realised he had nothing to do with anything illegal, but he wasn't allowed to make any phone calls or see anyone for ages. They interviewed me for the first time just before 11:30 p.m. They were asking me loads of questions about the gear they'd found in my van and where it'd come from. I was just going no comment to the whole lot, no matter what they said. I'd only been selling the stuff because DC Bird had told me to keep him with Mick. Well, in my mind anyway. I hadn't really done anything wrong. I was sure it was going to be fine, but then they played their trump card." "Okay, Miss Nichols, now, we believe that you were in convoy today and you were playing an active part in the transportation of 10 kilos of cannabis resin and you're being asked to make some form of comment regarding that." No comment. "I draw your attention to the fact that if you refuse to answer this question, it may affect other answers that you give at your trial. Do you understand that?" No comment. Right. "And lastly, that a record is being made, as I've said, of this tape, and should you later be prosecuted, this will be brought up at your trial. Do you understand?" No comment. Okay. "Well, if that is it, you've got the notice. I don't intend to say any more about the possession with intent to supply at the moment. The time by my watch is 23:35 hours, and you're now going to be arrested for being involved in the murder of Pat Tate, Craig Rolfe and Tony Tucker. Do you wish to make any comment to the fact that you've now been arrested for that murder?" No comment. I knew they were doing it to gauge a reaction, but I didn't make one. But as soon as they switched the tape off, I went mad. "What do you think you're doing arresting me for that? This was my worst nightmare coming true. And where was DC Bird?" The following day, the evidence against him was starting to mount up. Nichols was beginning to realise how hopeless his situation was. In addition to all the police and customs surveillance records, which now included still pictures and video footage, the police now had access to the phone records of both Nichols and Steele. Again, Nichols took the no-comment route, but it was obvious he was being backed into a corner. In fact, with neither Steele or Womes being caught in possession of drugs, there was more evidence against him than anyone else. And then, once again, just when things were looking at their bleakest, they got even worse. Just to put it in a nutshell here, Darren, what we're actually saying is that there's been a large importation of cannabis resin to this country. You have now been shown to have been privy immediately before this information came about by your association with Steele and the others. You have then subsequently, in the very early hours of the next morning, been involved directly in the importation of these drugs. Your vehicle has subsequently been forensically examined, and there is salt water and a large amount of sand consistent with this having been used on the beach, consistent with the importation taking place. You have been shown by surveillance to have been involved in the collection of a consignment of 10 kilos of cannabis resin. As far as I'm concerned, you're a large player in all the goings-on that have happened. You were so concerned at the time you were stopped that your first thought was to try to tell Mr. Steele that it had all come on top, as far as you were concerned. I feel in light of that summary, you should reconsider your situation. I want you to understand the enormity of what we are saying to you. Do you understand that? Fine. Now, I have a copy of your custody record from last night. This entry is timed at 21:16 hours, and it says, whilst carrying out the review, Mr. Nichols asked if he could speak to a nominated police officer known to him. I passed this to Superintendent Story, who declined this, and Nichols was informed of the above. Would you like to make any comment about that? No comment. Would you like to tell me who the police officer was that you wished to have some dialogue with at the time? No comment. Okay. I can tell you that at this moment, 2 police officers from Essex have been arrested and are currently in custody. Don't believe it. The officers have been charged with a number of offences, including some linked to the possession of controlled drugs. We have evidence that you have had numerous dealings with one of these officers. Is there any comment that you wish to make about that now? No. No comment. As soon as the interview was over, Nichols asked to see the most senior officer available. What happened next was recorded by DC Winston in his pocketbook. Quote, I was in company with Detective Superintendent Barrington when we spoke to Darren Nichols in an interview room. Nichols had signed the custody record to agree to be seen without a solicitor. This meeting had been requested by Mr. Nichols, who was introduced to Mr. Barrington. Nichols asked Mr. Barrington if he named the arrested officer, would he confirm it? Mr. Barrington agreed, and Mr. Nichols said, quote, is it DC Bird? Mr. Barrington confirmed this, and then he, Nichols, went on to say that this was how he had gotten into trouble and wanted to say he'd been set up. Mr. Barrington explained that regardless of what information Mr. Nichols gave, that he would be responsible and have to accept any sentence passed on him by the legal system. Mr. Nichols asked about what protection would be given to him and his family. Mr. Barrington said that Mr. Nichols must be totally honest in all details given so that an accurate judgment could be made regarding the level of protection offered. Mr. Nichols asked about protection in prison and was told about the system of protection that was available for registered informants. Mr. Nichols said he would be giving information regarding illegal activities of policemen and said that he did not say anything to DC Winston because he did not know if he could trust him. Darren Nichols states, I knew I didn't have a choice. I tried to put myself in Jack and Mick's shoes to wonder what was going through their minds, and pretty soon I realised I was totally screwed. 2 days earlier, Jack had threatened to kill me. The next day, he gets arrested. In Mick's case, I came round for the gear. An hour later, he gets arrested. It was a good bet that by now they also would have been told that a couple of policemen had been nicked and I was talking to one of them. It wouldn't take them long to put 2 and 2 together. And even if they didn't work out, I was given information about the smuggling side of things. I was still the weak link in the murder case. And now the cops were talking about remanding me in custody in Chelmsford Prison. That's exactly where they were going to put Jack and Mick and the others. I wouldn't last 5 minutes.